Hey everyone, I am Eric Weber in Ed Policy and Evaluation at the University of Kentucky. I'm making this video for students who have an intro project to write for one of my courses. Intro projects are a kind of assignment that I developed. It's probably something a lot of different professors do or something like it anyway. And what I'm going to talk about briefly in this video, hopefully it's brief, is first of all, the general writing recommendations that I end up sort of repeating every semester. I figured I'd make a video in which I lay them out. And so I've got 4 basic points and for kind of general writing recommendations, and then I'll talk about the intro project, kind of why I developed it, what an intro project is, how you can use them, as well as getting into the details of, okay, here's how you lay it out. And then I've got 3 samples. I don't know how many I'll end up talking about, but I've got a few samples to share. So here we go. So starting with the writing recommendations, this is a collection of thoughts that are especially about kind of what I'm looking for. And so a lot of the times students are anxious when they don't have a sense of what someone's looking for. And so there's certain priorities. If you're taking a creative writing class, the professor's looking for something different, right? If you're taking a course in ed policy, educational policy, or in the philosophy of education, or in ethics and educational decision making, or in certain sort of philosophical courses in educational policy studies and evaluation, then there's certain things I'm going to be looking for. And number one among them, first and foremost, is clarity and concision. In other words, get to the point, get straight to the point, and then let's talk about it, right? And so when you're writing, if you find yourself beating around the bush, it's okay to start writing that way, but then edit it to tighten it up and get to the point as quickly as you can, because there's lots to say about the given point. So we don't need to sort of beat around the bush. So get clear and concise and get going. Number 2 in my writing recommendations is to emphasize concreteness. Be concrete, be particular. So if someone says, oh, there's problems, oh, that's interesting. I mean, that'll be salient if I have a sense of what a problem you have in mind, for instance. Like, so I've got a project I'm working on called The Culture of Justice, and it concerns the ways in which justice can enable or inhibit the pursuit of justice. Culture can enable or inhibit the pursuit of justice. So what do I mean by that? That sounds very, very general, very vague, very big, broad brush. Sure. But when you get particular about examples, then you can sort of appreciate the point. That, for instance, the ACLU a number of years back argued in the Louisiana Supreme Court that a death row defendant, or that a defendant in a capital punishment case could not expect a fair trial in a courthouse over which the Confederate battle flag was flying. In other words, a symbol, a flag, right? But a symbol of the Confederacy in that case, right? Represented reason for a Black defendant in Louisiana to disbelieve that he or she would get a fair trial in court. That's kind of a big deal. And the Supreme Court of the state of Louisiana appreciated and agreed that it's reasonable that someone might come to that conclusion, which was kind of a big deal sort of decision. Anyway, so that's a concrete matter where someone wants, like, there's life and death on the line, and someone wants a fair trial, and there's a symbol over the courthouse that can lead you to reasonably believe that you can't expect a fair trial in that courthouse. That's kind of palpable. That's real kinds of problems. You see what I mean? So, one can sort of talk about vague things around the edges, but when you get concrete with an example like that, I think that really helps. It doesn't always have to be an example, but if you can get concrete about the kinds of worry, the tension, the issue going on, who's disagreeing with whom and why and so forth, that strengthens the project. Now, the next thing to bring up in my writing recommendations, I got this from a variety of places. My wife had a teacher who brought this up with her. I had a teacher who brought certain parts of this up with me. I don't know. This is the Weber amalgamation of 3 key questions that I ask any argumentative essay, including my own writing. I ask myself about this. If I'm not perfectly clear about my own writing, when I'm asking myself these questions about my writing, I've got to revise it and fix this issue. Okay, so number 1, the first key question that I ask about any argumentative essay is, what are you saying? If it isn't perfectly obvious what the person is saying in an essay, well, the task of communicating it hasn't succeeded, right? We should know what it is you're arguing in an argumentative essay, right? There should be a clear thesis. There should be that should be answering a clear issue. Okay, we'll come back to my distinctions between an issue and a topic in a little bit. But so number one is, what are you saying? And there are indicator words you can use in writing that make that can make that much clearer or more likely that we'll guess right. So in other words, if I say in this paper I will argue that, you know, what follows it should be my argument, should be the thing I'm arguing, right? So it should be perfectly clear. Some people feel that's like hitting you over the head with sort of blunt direction. Hey, this is my point. Please do that for me is what I'm asking you. And in fact, if you want to get published, it's often the case that it's not a bad idea to make sure that nobody has any doubts on what your thesis is. And if you have a bunch of sentences, sometimes people can get confused on what's the thesis and what isn't the thesis. And that is a problem if people are thinking you're making one case, but you end up not really supporting that over the course of the paper. That's not going to achieve the goal you wanted to. So again, first question, what are you saying? 3 key questions. That's the first one. Number 2 is, why is it important? This is a corollary of the notion of being concrete, but it's about demonstrating that this issue that you're choosing to talk about needs to be argued. If I make a powerful argument that there ought to be a University of Kentucky, well, that's nice and well, but who's going to listen to that? We already have a University of Kentucky. You know, it's weird to say we need one. Now, if someone's really were like attacking an institution saying we need to no longer have such institutions, well, that would make it more interesting, but it'd be kind of a weird thing. Like, who's really so opposed to having a public state university? Anyway, so, but my point is, you want to make sure that what you're arguing needs to be argued, right? So it's kind of, before you even get to the thesis, you know, when you're picking the issue you're going to be talking about, you want to think about the way in which that issue is important to people and how, in what ways. And if it's a policy issue, well, you know that there's certain sorts of decision making getting occurring as a result of this policy, and so you want to be clear on what's at stake, right? What are the kinds of things factoring into decision making about this? If you're making a point of principle, that's interesting too, but it's something that should matter somehow, right? It should be something for which there needs to be an argument. So I mentioned a number of ways in which that can be demonstrated. Well, at least with my flag issue, that would be an example. The third question is, so the first one was, what are you saying? Second one is, why is it important? The third question is, why should others agree? This is a really important question, and it's basically the reasons you hold for thinking what it is you're saying, for the reasons for number one, what are you saying, right? But there's 2 parts to that. The first part is understanding what the best arguments are against your view. If you don't address arguments against your view, well, how do you know you're right if you haven't considered the alternatives? And if you knock down a simple, stupid argument against your view, well, but have you really considered the smart alternatives to your view? And if you haven't, then I don't know if we're convinced about it, right? So the point is, you want to find the best arguments against your view. Think hard about why you don't agree, despite the reasons people give for that, and then be able to explain that, as well as explaining the reasons why you think what you do think, right? So there's really 2 parts to why should others agree. It's, you know, why don't you hold these other views that people hold that seem pretty well supported? And 2, you know, why do you hold the view that you do in particular, right? Because there's sometimes several alternatives to choose about an issue. Okay, so those are my 3 key questions that I'll ask about any argumentative essay. To sum up, what are you saying? Why is it important? Why should others agree? Okay, last but not least, in terms of writing recommendations, think about your goals. When you're writing a paper, you're doing it for a certain purpose. If your aim is you just want to get through certain coursework and you're going to write a paper of a certain, you know, for a class, right? In that sense, which is what I did when I entered grad school. Well, you know, you can get an A writing a term paper, but here's what I got on one of my papers from the guy who became my dissertation director. He wrote A, good, for a term paper. And I thought to myself, what does that mean? And of course, I figured it out really fast. I was behaving like a student and not thinking of myself as a scholar who might contribute to discourse, to public debate about this issue, or to my academic debate about this. And so the difference is that in a term paper, you take the readings that you did on the syllabus and you think about conflicts and different points of view about it, and you make some sort of argument based on the primary literature. Well, that's fine. But a lot of people have read these important primary texts and have written arguments about them. And so if you want to take the next step, if you want to do more than write a good term paper, and you can, right? The trick is to then gather as much secondary literature about your subject as you can. The more narrowly you've chosen your subject, the better. And the narrower is the group of things that you need to read. Of course, even when you narrow down, there's still a lot to read on that. But what you want to do is you want to collect as much as you can of the best stuff you can find on your subject, read it, and then situate what you're going to say about that within the context of the relevant literature, then making your case. And that is when you show that you know what people have said, what the best arguments are about it, and you are advancing knowledge in the area by adding your contribution, your reasons for thinking what you do, right? What we should do, what we should think if you're right. Okay, so those are the four main major writing recommendations that I repeat over and over. Number one, clarity and concision are much more important to me than beauty of expression. Okay, it's if you want to focus on the beauty of the writing, do it after you've got a clear structure and strong set of arguments and clear understanding of the issue. Be concrete. Ask yourself those three questions. What am I saying? Why is it important? Why should others agree? And then think about your goals. It seems to me by default, you should start by thinking about how can I contribute to scholarship? And then if you've got a crazy busy semester and it's really tough to put in all the time it might take, then you do what you can, and that's life, right? And you can come back to it later and enrich your paper by doing some more research on the area, and then seeing, do I have something new to add here to discourse about the matter? And almost surely the answer is yes, or it's quite possible to tweak what you have to say to sort of make a finer point about what you were arguing about. And then you could consider sending it to conferences and journals and so forth. Okay, so that's the big picture, Weber's writing and recommendations. Now let's talk about intro projects. What is an intro project? The issue is, many years ago, when I started teaching, I got a lot of essays where people would sort of talk a bit about something and then meander right and left and about, all around. And then they'd get to a conclusion and say, in conclusion, I think this. And so often it was the case that what preceded did not explain why they came to that conclusion. And I was befuddled. I was really struck that the paper didn't give support for the claim that the person ultimately made. And so there's a tendency in middle school and high school for people to teach you to write this 5-paragraph theme or 5-page or whatever, where you introduce something, you start talking about it for the body, and then in conclusion, you think this. And that's a common way writing is taught at certain levels. When we're looking to make an argumentative essay, every part of the essay should contribute somehow to making the point you intend to make, whether that's laying out the context of the issue, explaining the different points of view on the matter, explaining the best argument against your view, explaining why you disagree with that, and then explaining why you think what you think, right? All those things need to happen in order to write a good argumentative essay. But you're not going to do that if you don't have a clear plan up front. This is part of the problem. What I found was people would figure out what they wanted to say by the end of writing something. And so what I said is, okay, let's write something, but make it short. Make it the introduction to your paper. And by the end of writing your introduction to your paper, I should hear the thesis, right? And for some reason, that seems to really work because people want to put their conclusion of their argument at the end because it's the conclusion. But in logic, an argument doesn't have to have the conclusion at the end. The thesis or the claim or the conclusion of an argument is that sentence for which the other sentences give reason to believe it, right? So for instance, if I say, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates will die. Well, the conclusion happens at the end there, but I can put the conclusion of the argument at the beginning. I can say, you should bring your umbrella. Why? Because it looks like it's getting cloudy out, and I just heard the weather forecast saying it's going to rain. So you should bring your umbrella, right? So I had started with that though. And so the end or the conclusion is the aim, is the purpose of the argument. It's what all the stuff is supposed to give you reason to believe. It doesn't have to happen at the end, very end of the argument, right? So it's not about where it is, but if you end if you end an introduction with your thesis, then all the rest of the paper is written informed by the point that you're trying to make in that thesis statement. So that's where the idea of the intro project originated. The way I've designed it, this is one way to write. It's not the only way to write. It's a darn good way to write, and it's a way that will get you published in journals. You can write books this way. You can write grant applications this way. This is a method, and it makes sure that you do all the things you need to do in good writing. Can you do it other ways? Yes, but you'd have to check all these boxes, but maybe somehow in an intelligently different order. So this is Weber's order. This is what I'm asking you to try and do. You're incredibly free in what you argue, which position you take, all that stuff within the context of my class. You got to obviously be roughly in the category of what we're trying to do and learn in the class, but you're very free in all those things. What I do ask is for you to please very carefully follow less freedom in the method. I want you to follow a certain method to get a strong paper well defined. So what is an intro project? An intro project is the introduction to your paper, though you haven't necessarily written the paper yet. The point is, if you don't know what issue you're trying to address, if you don't know what kinds of positions are different from yours that need to be answered, if you don't know the reasons for your own view, how can you have a clearly laid out structure for your paper? Those are all things you got to figure out in order to write a good paper. Right. And therefore, those things are what goes into an intro project. Now, what can you use an intro project for? You can use an intro project, obviously, for writing a paper for my class. You can use it for a conference paper. You can use it as an abstract for a paper that's like a proposal for conferences when they don't ask for the whole paper. You can write the proposal as an intro project, and it lays out the issue, how people think about it, why you disagree, what it is, what are the reasons you think what you do, and how you're going to develop that argument, how you're going to demonstrate it over the course of a paper. So that's what goes into an intro project. Now, so again, you can use that, as I said, for course papers, for conference proposals, for conference papers, for journal articles, and for books. Right? You can write an intro project for the overarching idea of the book, and then you can, for each chapter, you might write an intro project for each chapter. Basically, each part has to be introduced, right? And so, thinking this through, this is a way I do just about all of my writing, grant applications as well. So now, so there's a lot of different purposes for which you can use this, and the key is to become succinct and clear, getting to the point immediately and focusing on what is relevant and important to make your case. All right, so now let's get into the details. I'm going to share my screen and show you the guidelines I use in one of my grad courses. It's only minorly tweaked. The method stays the same. The content and substance changes across my classes. So if I say philosophy of education here, in another class, it might say the ethical issues in educational decision making, or it might say whatever other course I'm teaching, right? So there's a method here and a reason for it. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll go over some examples after we go through the details. So on my syllabi, I say something like the following: each student will be asked to prepare 300 to 500 word intro project representing a proposal for what the introduction to his or her final paper might look like. It should actually be an effort to introduce the paper that he or she has not yet written, but has researched carefully. You do have to do some work beforehand, right? Considered and mapped out. It should very clearly and precisely present an issue arising in the philosophy of education, or if it's another class, in the ethics of educational decision making, or what have you, to be decided, or about which the author calls either for change or for the defense of the status quo against proposed changes. Basically, there's a lot of different reasons why you might make an argument, all in the educational context of the student's choosing. The issue should clearly be important and live. In other words, it should be something that needs to be argued. The student should also bring the scholarship we study to bear on the issue forcefully. So obviously you want to dig into our material for the class that we cover, either in application or in critique of the traditional outlooks. You don't have to agree with what we read. You can disagree with them, but then show how and why you intelligently disagree with that stuff in application. The project should feature a focused and carefully crafted thesis statement, even if only as an hypothesis for what the author believes he or she will argue, but stated as a claim. A preview of the reasons why he or she thinks so, and an introduction of the key elements he or she will use in making her case. Finally, the intro project should conclude with a short 3 to 5 sentence paragraph explicitly laying out the steps that the paper will take in presenting the student's argument. So there's a bunch of things going on in here. And some of this gets broken down basically in the specific suggestions. And then the next page has the structure that I'd like for people to follow. Okay, so first you want to pick a topic, and by a topic, I mean something actually fairly big. When we say topics, I have in mind the kind of thing that gets captured in a term. So let's say, someone is interested in, well, I guess in the philosophy of education, someone might be interested in the purposes of a school. Should a school, for instance, be working towards social justice? So you might say social justice and educational curricula would be the topic. Now, the issue, when you talk about an issue, is more focused, and for my purposes, an issue should be understood as a question to be answered with your thesis, and that people might answer differently. So, for instance, should teachers see as part of their purpose the advancement of social justice in education? Because in some places people think social justice sounds controversial. They want maybe civic engagement, but they don't want sort of certain kinds of activism. And then others think it's a core of what you're doing in education to, empower students for the sake of social justice. There's disagreements about this kind of thing. And then you got to consider what are the philosophical views that we've talked about, and how do they weigh in on that, right? You want to think about not just what someone like Plato or Dewey or Jane Roland Martin or something, not just what some particular philosophers had to say, but also kind of the different points of view of relevant stakeholders who have argued about this or who have held positions about it publicly somehow. And you can find that in newspapers and journals and all kinds of places, right? You want to pick good sources, and you want to sort of make sure you lay out the ways in which the scholarship we talk about or that you can identify contributes to that discussion in a number of fashions. You want to solidify a clear thesis statement, that takes a position with regard to the debate or about the debate if you think both sides are wrong for some reason in a different way. And then outline for yourself the reasons that people disagree with you, right? It's really important to understand the merits of your opposition's arguments. If you don't really know, if you don't feel comfortable looking at the reasons why people think differently from you, then you're not being terribly secure in your own outlook, right? And if you think you might change your mind based on what you read, isn't that wonderful? That's what we're supposed to be doing in learning things, right? And at the same time, though, if you feel as though the arguments that you find in the best positions in the best articulations of positions that differ from yours, then you can explain, hopefully, why it is you don't agree with those really good arguments, if those are the best, right? And then, of course, as I said, lay out the reasons, not just why you disagree with others, but also why you think what you do about that issue. So I've talked about that, and I mentioned Weber's writing recommendations. I used to have a different handout. I'm just talking about both these things now in one video. Okay, so if you've done that for yourself on paper, you've thought it through, you can talk with me, you can talk to peers, you can think this out, and sometimes it can really help to actually read your thoughts aloud. And when you hear them, they don't sound as good as you thought sometimes, or they sound different argument sounds great, and you're sort of surprised, and now it turns out that's what you think, right? Anyway. All right, so now let's get into the particulars of writing an intro project. Okay, so I even get down to the nitty gritty of how many sentences you should consider certain things, right? My opening for an intro project, remember I said clarity and concision, get to the point right away in the first 1 to 3 sentences. The ideal is for the reader to know the issue, at least, that you're presenting, that you're going to be talking about. Immediately set a concrete context. Immediately set a conflict into concrete context, right? So as much as you can be concrete about it, the better. I remember that an undergraduate student wrote an amazing opening sentence in an intro project years ago where he was talking about the Gen 6, which were 6 African-American students at a school who got into trouble with the police over certain activities at school, and there was just awful white supremacy in the school. It was just this incredibly powerful sentence that drew you in and made you think, oh my goodness, how can this be the case? But it was true, right? And we've got to think more about this. This something's going on here that should be different. Right. Anyway, so think about the conflict that you're talking about and set it into concrete context to the greatest extent that you can, and then making sure that it's clear why the issue you've chosen is important. I mean, if people's lives are on the line, it's kind of obvious why that's the case. If the issue is that, you know, a teacher was fired for presenting certain kind of social justice material, well, then you've got a concrete reason why we should be thinking about whether or not the teachers should be advancing the aims of social justice, right? So anyway, in 1 to 3 sentences, you can do that. In one powerful sentence, sometimes you can do it. And I'll show you some examples from longer to actually nice and concise, real tight and short. But anyway, number 2, in 1 to 4 sentences, now lay out the variety of views one could hold about the matter. So when it comes to the example I chose of activism, you know, versus civic engagement, people see civic engagement as a matter of empowering citizens to know how to, you know, get in touch with their local authorities and maybe call for something to happen. Let's say, you know, there's a need for a sidewalk to be repaired or a stop sign at a road where it's really busy and it would be safer if there were a stop sign. Getting civically engaged might help make that stop sign a reality, right? And in some senses, you might have greater justice if someone had gotten killed at that intersection. You're going to make sure people don't die accidentally. It can sound like a justice issue, but at the same time, this is sort of no particular group was targeted. And anyway, the point is that civic engagement is one thing, but social justice is another. You might be critiquing the foundations of how certain things work in our society and calling for pretty major change. Like a stop sign is easy, right? But dealing with systemic racism is not so easy, right? And it's more complicated. And anyway, so lay out the different views people hold about these sorts of things in 1 to 4 sentences. I remember thinking about violent video games, and this had to do with young kids and early childhood education issues. And both Hillary Clinton and Senator McCain at the time, he's passed now, both of them, Republicans, a Democrat and a Republican, had argued against certain violent video game permissions, like that we shouldn't be allowing certain sorts of things in violent video games. Anyway, so you can show how, you know, different sides of the aisle can both oppose something, and then you can have a representative from the video gaming, you know, industry or something like that, and talking about freedom and enjoyment and the relief of stress for adults or something like that. They're giving you kinds of examples of arguments people have made before. Anyway, lay out the different varieties of views there are about the relevant issue you've chosen. Now, describe briefly the ways in which specific outlooks in the philosophy of education or in ethics and educational decision-making or in whatever class I'm teaching, right? The things we've been reading, how they can inform the debate about the issue, but not just the things on the syllabus, by the way. Again, if you're trying to publish an article, you want to make sure you're looking not just at primary text, but expansively, widely at the kinds of outlooks that people have raised and how the issue can offer a way to rethink the relevant views at stake. So sometimes it's the issue is we've got insight and we need to apply it and get a better, you know, outcome. Sometimes we say, well, these outlooks we've been using are causing the conflict. We need a different outlook on this issue, whatever that is. Let's say the freedom of teachers to be advocates. You know, sometimes it's controversial. People think teachers should be, you know, maybe teachers shouldn't be advocates for issues, you know, they should be impartial, right? Versus, oh, well, it's a consequence of what they're doing. Of course they have to advocate for justice or whatever it is. You know, anyway, those are the different kinds of views people hold. And 2 to 6 sentences should be enough to do that, laying out the different kinds of views that are at stake. And then state a clear and specific thesis that addresses the issue in question, as well as how the considerations you've mentioned weigh in on the issue or can be informed by it. And please, I ask you, begin the sentence with, in this paper, I will argue that. And and only have one thesis statement. Sometimes people have that, and then they have these three other sentences that talk about what they're arguing. And if they're the same thing, that's okay. But when you make slightly different formulations, wait a minute, which one is your thesis now? Make it crystal clear that there's one thesis, And when you refer back to it, make sure that we're clear what it is you're referring back to. And you shouldn't say, in this paper, I will argue whether or not we should do X. No, that's not telling me the thesis. That's telling me you're going to come up with a thesis about that question, whether or not we should do X. That's the issue, right? Whether or not we should do this or that is the issue. The thesis is we should do this, whatever that is, right? In your giving context. Okay. So now, after you've done this, so you've got 1 to 3 sentences, 1 to 4 sentences, 2 to 6 sentences. The thesis should be 1 sentence, unless you need somehow another little clarification, but just make clear that this is the thesis and maybe this is just sort of a preview of reasons or whatever. Anyway, so I refer to the intro project as not just being 1 paragraph, by the way. It can be 1 paragraph, but in laying this out, it's clearer if you say that these things are 1 paragraph and this is a 2nd paragraph. It doesn't have to be 2 different paragraphs. Anyway, I called whatever this section does, I call it the structural description. Okay, so you should be describing this structure of your paper. Okay, this short paragraph, 1 to 5 sentences, it can be 1 sentence, right? 1 to 5 sentences should explain as clearly and specifically as possible how you intend to argue the position you have chosen. It should begin with words like, in what follows, I will first, or in defending the view that blah, that I articulated in my thesis, I will begin with a discussion of, right? You want that kind of signposting to be perfectly clear what it is you're going to be saying. I want each step of what will come in your paper to be explicit and chosen with a clear purpose. Subsequent sentences should signpost the next specific steps of the paper. Next, I will this, and in the 3rd section, I'll do that. Finally, I'll do this. And one quick word about something that people often have questions about. Can I use personal pronouns like I will do this? When you're writing an argument, it's your argument. You're arguing something. So of course you can do that. And in fact, if you read one of the papers I have from Einstein is a paper in physics, for goodness sake. You would think of all disciplines, you wouldn't hear I, we, and so forth. But Einstein, I can share a paper with you where Einstein uses we in arguing what they're arguing, right? What they're thinking, articulating what they're thinking. So there's different paradigms and different traditions. For me, you're making an argument. Tell me what you're arguing. I argue this, and so forth. Okay. Now, one way to order what comes next in your paper is as follows. And frankly, many papers, if not most papers, should have something like this sort of structure. Okay. First of all, you should tell us more about this issue, right? Your thesis is answering the issue question. And therefore, in the first section of your paper, I should probably hear more about this issue, get a little bit more of the background. So describe the context of the issue, such as how it came to be an issue or why it is of continuing importance. This is one way of describing a literature review portion of your paper, right? So if this is a journal article, this context section is what you call the lit review section. Second, explain how either, number 1, the philosophers and figures you mentioned can weigh in on the debate in question valuably, like teach us something, right? Or 2, show how the issue you're talking about or theories you've chosen to examine must be revisited or updated in light of historical developments and contemporary problems that can inform new understandings of the philosophy of education or ethics and educational decision-making and so forth. So what would be a way you could update these things? Well, for instance, in hospitals and in medical ethics care, medical ethical education, right? We have the concept that's very important of consent. When you go to the doctor, you sometimes have to sign all these forms. The real question is, if you're just signing your name and they say sign here and, do you want to see the form? Well, they're asking you to sign about your understanding of a form that they haven't even handed you. And so the notion that you're granting consent is deeply problematic in that context. Now, what you may be doing is waiving your right to know what it is they're about to do. But technically, if people hurt you and you didn't understand it, that's only so much protection, for the hospital or whomever, right? So in other words, the concept of consent is itself still something needing more understanding, right? And it's a very basic notion that we use in ethics. And we need to refine our understanding of this. All the time I've clicked, have you read the terms and agreements involved in using this software? I did a talk at a conference and asked people at a philosophy conference in ethics, how many of you in the last 6 months have clicked yes to I agree to the terms and conditions of this without reading it? just about every hand went up. I didn't check whether it was every, but like hands everywhere went up. Of course, we click. Oh, just I don't need to read all the fine print. Come on, just go on. And in a sense, it's good to have that language because they have thought about the ways in which people might be upset or get hurt. And so it's good to have those policies. But am I really consenting? And I think, if knowledge matters for consent, they haven't shown that I knew what I was signing. Right. And so now you could argue that it's on me. That's an interesting point. But the point is that the concept of consent ain't finished. Right. We haven't finished figuring out how to do this and what it means. Anyway, so again, it can be that the issue you're talking about shows a problem or a need to revise or refine our concepts, such as consent. A lot of detail about this example here, but the point is, sometimes we have these nice theories that are really helpful and that can inform us about an issue. Sometimes we have issues that inform us that we need to revisit or refine our theories. So it could go either which way on this. Now, depending on the execution, this can also be an element of your lit review. So you could have both of these in sort of a lit review section. Some of the kinds of divisions of these things can be arbitrary. Sometimes there's a good reason for dividing them in the way that you do. So anyway, third, clearly explain who might disagree with your thesis and why, listing the reasons as carefully and as coolly as possible. In other words, don't just dismiss someone. Don't just insult someone. The person you're trying to convince may be reading this. Right. And hopefully that's the point, isn't it? If you're trying to convince anybody, hopefully you can convince somebody who doesn't think what you think and is reading this. So don't insult them if they think a different view, if they hold a different view. So, be cool about it. That builds your credibility, and then show why you disagree with them respectfully. Right. Try to give the best case you can against your view, and then show nevertheless why you think what you do. Okay. And then fourth, explain succinctly yet persuasively as you can the basic reasons your paper will cover that show why others should agree with your thesis. That's what goes into an intro project. Now, this is 300 to 450 words. It's hard, or 300 to 500 words. A double-spaced page should be about 300 words. So it's 1 to 2 pages, a little bit less, hopefully, than 2 pages. And so that is what goes into an intro project. And it's fairly strict, the things you're asked to do, but what you argue, how you apply it is incredibly open. All right. Now I've got for you an undergraduate student student who wrote a paper for my ethics and public policy course. She submitted her paper to a conference. It was accepted and she presented it. And then they invited her to submit her paper for Acta Cogitata, which is a journal, an undergraduate journal, and she did. And after further peer review, it was accepted and published. This is Christine Dickinson's paper in Acta Cogitata called America's Schools, Separate and Unequal. And I'm going to read, let's see, her abstract. Part of the, so an abstract can be an introduction, but it's often shorter, actually. But notice that this is her abstract, and the first paragraph, anyway, is even shorter than her abstract. It might be her introduction, but this is after several steps of refinement and tightening up and concision, right? So this paper explores how various philosophers contribute to the discussion of the racial integration of public schools. I assert that racial integration is a moral necessity. Boom. She asserts that it is a moral necessity, and the government should create policy to ensure the successful integration of our public schools. To support this claim, that's her claim, so we know that. I will first expand upon the context of the issue. I will then address libertarians who would counter my thesis with a focus on the freedom of individuals. I will use utilitarian ideas to demonstrate that racially diverse public schools maximize the good in society. However, utilitarianism fails to explain what I believe is the crux of the problem. Therefore, I will draw on theories of democracy, the individual, and justice in the writings of Dewey, Kant, and Rawls to address the components of racial segregation that disrespect the inherent worth of human beings. Aristotelian ideas on what it means to be a flourishing human being will support my claim that segregated schooling is irrational, immoral, and contradicts the purpose of education. Finally, I will argue that civic virtue calls for unity and solidarity, which are vital to the optimal functioning of society and which are threatened when schools are racially separated. Now, you might think to yourself, holy hell, that's an undergraduate who wrote that? Yes, it is. And she's very smart, and she's actually pursuing her PhD right now at Vanderbilt. That said, this is an undergraduate who wrote this, but she wrote it for my class, got feedback on it, improved it, presented it at a conference, got feedback on it, improved it, submitted it to the journal, got feedback on it, and improved it. If this seems really good, well, A, she's very talented, and B, she went through a bunch of strengthening the project, which is why it resulted in a published paper. Okay, you can do this too. This was a 21-year-old student who did this as an undergraduate. You can do it too, okay? Another example I have for you is from Andrew Nelson. Now I share this with you and tell you the person's name because this is publicly available. This is published. This is out there. By the same token, Andrew Nelson wrote a piece for my class, which he also abbreviated and submitted to the Midwest Educational Research Association conference, and he got in. And here is his abstract for that, okay? It's the paper's called Do No Harm, Critiquing the Beneficence of the What Works Clearinghouse's Review Standards. So What Works Clearinghouse is well, it has review standards, okay? And he's critiquing that. Okay, so demands for evidence-based education policy have asked program evaluation to mimic the methodological standards of more rigorous fields, such as biomedical research. One particularly prominent example is the What Works Clearinghouse, which relies on a set of methodological standards to audit, synthesize, and disseminate research about what works in education. The purpose of this project was to explore if and how the WWC's appropriation of certain methodological standards from biomedical research has come at the cost of neglecting accompanying ethical standards. Specifically, this work calls upon the legacy of beneficence. Bene is good, fica means to make, so you're trying to make things good, right? In other words, to maximize the good well-being. In both applied and theoretical ethics to scrutinize the WWC review standards. Let me start the sentence again. Specifically, this work calls upon the legacy of beneficence in both applied and theoretical ethics to scrutinize the WWC's review standards. As a result of my analysis, I conclude that the current What Works Clearinghouse standards violate this legacy of beneficence by 1, privileging desired outcomes while ignoring potential consequences, 2, privileging certain research designs irrespective of context or the withholding of benefits, and 3, privileging quantitative data while overlooking supplemental qualitative information. So now this was a graduate student, Andrew Nelson, and this is also public information insofar as it's on the Midwest Educational Research Association's website. And he presented at the conference publicly, and so I'm sharing this with you. And he gave me permission. They all gave me permission to do this, by the way. But anyway, so I wanted to share this with you and show how the language of do no harm, which is sort of the simple version of expressing a key element of the principle of beneficence, he shows that the What Works Clearinghouse doesn't do all it should do to do no harm, right? This is a powerful piece. Now, in this case, this is a student who primarily worked in sort of evaluation and quantitative kind of work, right? This is someone who works in evaluation, right? And you might think, oh, these people obviously have backgrounds in philosophy and so on. I mean, they have taken some of those courses perhaps, but these are not people who've majored in that. These are people who are smart, they think hard, and they apply what we're talking about to their greatest areas of interest. And that's something I strongly encourage you to do. You should be picking something that you're passionate about writing. I've talked about this in other videos and other class meetings, but the selection of your subject matter obviously is key, and that's not the subject of this video right now. But I said I had 3 examples, and I do. I don't think, I'm not sure I shared my screen when I was reading that. Oh, goodness. This is I will share a link to these files to make sure you have that, the demands for evidence-based educational policy. All right, here we go. So I've read that too at the very least, and you'll have a link to it. Now, the third piece I wanted to share with you is by another grad student. This was someone from my philosophy of education course. So the other one was from an ethics and public policy course for undergraduates. The next one was from my ethics and educational decision-making course. And this is from my philosophy of education course, Educating for Democracy, How Compulsory National Service Can Overcome Disengagement. There's a big quote from Barack Obama. It is pretty, but I'm going to jump to the author's text to make the point that I'm making about intro projects. And you can have opening quotes, and they're lovely, but I'm going to jump to the material here that this person wrote following my guidelines. The year 2019 marks the 400th anniversary of arguably the darkest moment in American history, Millions of Africans were seized from their homes, smuggled across the Atlantic, and sold for indentured servitude. Without question, the story of the transatlantic slave trade serves as a stark reminder of what can happen when our shared humanity is cast aside. Yet, there are noticeable signs that today we remain morally detached from the suffering of others. We shake our heads in disgust when we hear about police brutality. We change the channel when we see images of immigrant children in cages, and we quickly forget the unrelenting genocide in non-Western countries long faded from headlines. Now, let me stop there just for a second. This is about four-ish sentences. One, and then two, then three, and then we get to four. And that we're really getting our issue that people are turning their heads. They're becoming disengaged from big moral problems. These wicked problems is a technical term, but you know, you don't need to know that yet. These wicked problems are cumbersome, hard to solve, and overwhelming, to say the least. That's sort of the definition of a wicked problem. These are really difficult, entrenched problems that seem really, you know, difficult to overcome. Without social and political will to act, indifference and even antipathy can fester and stand in the way of progress. Americans need to experience the bonds of community and practice doing real work together if we are to rebuild and trust and learn to act in compassionate ways. I believe that universal national service provides a unique opportunity to heal an otherwise divided, disillusioned, and disengaged nation. This paper calls upon policymakers to restore civility and social connectedness through the expansion of paid full-time service opportunities. Specifically, I will argue that compulsory participation in a year of service will teach more young people to negotiate their differences with others while building their sense of efficacy and interest in devising solutions to wicked problems. That's a long thesis, but it's not more than three lines at least, and it is clear, powerful, and provocative. I want to read more. Now, here's the structural description. In what follows, I will first describe how the erosion of social capital and immediacy has deluded us into believing we can deny the humanity of others and passively observe their suffering. As evidence, I will illustrate our failure to adequately respond to crises of drinking water, climate change, and mass shootings. Next, I will revisit William James's proposal of national service as the moral equivalent of war, arguing that its purpose builds social cohesion and empathic spirit in a time when we are in desperate need of unification. Many opponents argue that compulsory service undermines autonomous freedom, that it will demoralize the American spirit of volunteerism. On the contrary, I am proposing that mandatory national service will strengthen the social ties that bind us as a nation by restoring education for democracy. Young people can and should learn the practice of shared social responsibility. Moreover, individual liberties and honor are safeguarded when the experience is driven by the interest of the individuals. Finally, I will close by reiterating that cynicism and complacency can be alleviated through encounters with a diversity of thought, the conditions which restore trust, empathy, and ultimately lead to progress. All right, this powerful introduction is to a paper that a student is working on submitting for a journal publication, and I think it's pretty exciting. To my mind, this is a powerful topic, and it's a great demonstration of what I was getting at, getting quickly and concretely and powerfully to define an issue. Now, there were a lot of problems this paper talked about, but the fundamental issue at stake had to do with people sort of feeling like they should give up. Like, it's about whether or not people feel empathy and purpose and will to engage in addressing difficult problems that are called wicked problems. So this was a paper about enabling trust, empathy, and engagement. And so sometimes that means you're going to talk, your examples will be manifold. You'll have lots of different kinds of examples. Okay, so that's 3 projects, 2 by grad students, 2 of them, 2 by grad students and 1 by an undergraduate. And you can do this when you have a chiseled, 300 to 500 words on the introduction for your paper. The carrying out of the plan is so much easier than writing a paper without this kind of start. You can be meandering, you can be all over the place, you can be frustrated, you're not sure what's needed in the paper. But when you have this kind of plan, you know what's needed in the paper. You just said it's going to be these sections, right? And so, it's all, to my mind, about having a strong and quality plan. to my mind, writing a good paper is a lot like bowling insofar as the introduction of the ball to the lane is everything, right? Because if you don't have a smart introduction of the ball to the lane, it's going to go into the gutter or who knows where, right? But it's all about introducing, and then the rest is sort of carrying that momentum forward. You can follow that plan carefully and end up with a really powerful paper. And so I invite you to let me know what you think about it. One more thought about intro projects. Anytime, if you want feedback from me or anybody else on some writing on something, and you send us 60 pages, well, you're going to have to wait a long time before you get the feedback on that. But if you send me 300 to 500 words, I can get you feedback on that, within a couple of days at the latest, right? It's quick to get feedback on that, and making tweaks to the, short text about the plan makes all the difference in the world to the paper, much more than commenting a lot of times on many different pages. This is the idea, it's the issue, it's the argument, it's the structure. Get that strong and clear, and you can write an excellent and outstanding paper. You just have to carry out the great plan that you've devised. And I would be happy to look at multiple versions before the thing is due, or even after it's due, whatever. The point is, before the final paper, go through as many iterations as you can of tightening up your plan and your issue, your argument, and your thesis, right? Get as tight and solid as you can with that, and the rest of the paper will benefit enormously from that clear and strong and compelling plan. Okay, so let me know what questions you have. Reach out to me, and maybe I'll make another video on something related. All right. I'm sorry it took me a while to get around to making this video. There's a lot to think about and talk about in this, and I hope you benefit from it. Take care.